Okay, good evening. Everybody's present, so I suppose we can begin. We can start, okay? Now, in our last class, I completed discussing with you until the self-rated poverty, okay? And I discussed with you the most widely used data in order to measure the subject matter of economic development, which is the change in the standard of living, the material standard of living over time among countries. Okay. And the focus of a lot of the concern in development economics would be how to raise the standard of living of developing countries and how to reduce poverty in these countries, because countries that are described as being developed countries are countries with high GNI per capita and low rates of poverty, manifesting itself in a reasonable material standard of living for the majority of the population. So I went through the data and their uses and limitations, went through the data on GNI accounting and some of the limitations, and therefore the additional data that has been used, such as using purchasing power parity corrected adjusted figures, and also using concepts such as social wage and consumption per capita. And we looked at poverty and the different ways by which poverty is conceptualized and measured. The absolute notion of poverty, the relative notion of poverty, and then we have this self-rated approach to poverty. The last and the self-rated approach to poverty, it also includes data here on the experience of uh, people in terms of hunger. Okay, how much hunger they've experienced. Okay, and this data is until 2018. There are more recent data already, and it shows that hunger levels have had a long-term decrease from about 2010 until 2019, but last year, because of the pandemic, it spiked. Okay? And the experience of severe hunger has also spiked. The levels of severe hunger have always been hovering below 5% since 1998, but definitely did spike last year. This is an indicator of poverty, which therefore brings us to the last topic insofar as the conceptualization of development is concerned, and that is how to conceptualize and understand this notion of poverty. Okay, poverty is seen really as not simply being a situation of not having enough income. Okay, uh, the Nobel Prize economist Amartya Sen, who won the Nobel Prize back in 1999 or 2000, went back to the writings of Adam Smith and adopted the notion of Adam Smith, where Adam Smith says that being poor or being in a state of poverty is the person's lack of ability of facing society without shame. The idea behind this concept is that poverty cannot be resolved simply by providing incomes. Because if that were the case, they can always engage in crime. Okay. But once their criminal activity is publicly exposed, then that ends their involvement in society. The classic recent cases that of Janet Napoles, for example. Okay. The idea is that it matters a lot, not so much that the person can have income, but the source of that income. Okay. So the Sen interpretation of Adam Smith's discussion is to think of poverty as a state of social exclusion, meaning to say that poor people are poor because they are being removed from effective participation in society. Society, however broadly defined, from your small community to the national, even international community. Okay. And the idea is that the poverty one experiences is not a question of not having enough money, enough income. In fact, you might be having some money, you might be having some income, but uh, the poverty is the outcome of what is called a capability deprivation. Okay. That poor people are poor because they lack some of the capabilities that will allow them to live a minimally decent life. There are many forms of deprivation of capability. Okay. You do have deprivation of capability whenever people are not allowed by society to obtain access to proper nutrition, healthcare, education, and jobs because of their gender, because of their ethnicity, because of their race, their religion, and the like. Okay, so this would be systematic deprivation. But even in societies where these types of restricted access are not present, okay, when you do have equal opportunities for women and men, for people of different sexual orientation, for people of different religions, ethnicities, races, okay, still poverty happens there because there are people who still experienced very basic capability deprivation. And these capabilities have to do with access to nutrition, healthcare, basic education, and a job. As Amartya Sen would put it, okay, when you're talking about access to nutrition, that often begins when one is still in the womb. When an expecting mother is not properly given the proper nutrition and health care assistance, then it could happen that the child, sorry, she carries would be malnourished. Now, even if the child was properly nourished, if the child is unable to get the sufficient nutritional requirements while still an infant, okay, then it could stunt the child. Okay, they could experience stunting. and if they're going to experience malnutrition, okay, what would happen is that their physical capacity is restricted. Now, the problem here is really quite lifetime. When you're stunted, when you are severely malnourished from an early age, what would happen is that your brain does not grow to the maximum possible capacity, which means that you would have difficulty in absorbing knowledge and in wading through uh, complicated intellectual activity, which means you'd have difficulty later on in completing technical education or so that will end up depriving you of access to high paying jobs. So this access to nutritional services, of course, becomes very, very important, very, very crucial. Okay. That's why in many in many developed countries, in Europe especially, in the welfare states, expectant mothers are provided with nutritional supplements, and they're regularly monitored. And infants and children all the way to the elementary school years do receive some form of a nutritional supplement from government. Okay? And in many European countries, they provide a daily meal to all the elementary school students. The idea is that it's not so much relying, it's not so much spoon feeding the children. It's trying to ensure that the young will have all the necessary nutritional requirements so that they will not become much of a burden on society later. Okay, so that even though the parents can afford to provide them the proper nutrition, this regular nutrition program is meant to ensure that young actually do get their um, regular nutritional requirements fulfilled, which is very important for their own growth into adulthood. Now, the next type of capability deprivation would be in terms of healthcare. Um, Even if one is properly nourished, okay, um, especially while you're a child, okay, but even later when you're already a teenager or an adult, okay, in the absence of access to affordable healthcare, you could end up with a very, very severe capability deprivation. And it is that because of lack of access to healthcare facilities, it could happen that you'd end up being chronically ill. You end up always being sick. Okay? And your being sickly means that you might not be able to complete your education. Okay, and by not being able to complete your education, then once more you've restricted the income earning opportunities that you could have access to in the future. Okay? Or as an adult, you have lots of cases of adults who may have been earning well, especially here in the Philippines. So those who are supported by substantial earnings from family members who are overseas workers. But when a member of the family gets severely ill, say cancer, there are many stories about that, and already some data have been covered that a lot of their earnings end up with regards to the medication of the person because there isn't any comprehensive healthcare system here, and there are lots of out-of-pocket expenses. So the result is it a substantial financial drain on the family, and therefore a general inability for their socioeconomic status to improve. So that's another very important capability deprivation. And then there's access to basic education. So even if one had access to proper nutrition and healthcare facilities are available, what if one is unable to complete your education for whatever reason? Okay. And when we say basic education, the education that one gets from the elementary schools in terms of getting the basic skills, reading, writing, arithmetic, okay, and extended to the secondary level, okay, by which one then is given an introduction to a wide range of ideas, a wide range of possible skills and the like. Okay. When one is able to complete basic education, one can then go further into further education and or absorb further technical training, which will then allow one access to high productivity, higher paying jobs. Okay. But in the absence of basic education, those higher paying jobs you no longer can take advantage of. You will be permanently, okay, restricted to lower paying jobs and may therefore restrict your ability to improve your socioeconomic status. Okay. And then there are instances where people, though with proper nutrition, healthcare, and with education and the like, would be deprived of access to a wide range of jobs. And this usually happens because of systematic discrimination along lines of gender, ethnicity, religion, race, and the like. Okay, when this happens once more, it uh, restricts one away from the higher paying jobs and once more restricts one's ability to earn and through the earnings to be able to participate reasonably in society. Okay, so this particular concept of Amartya Sen wants to go beyond the income-based notion of poverty to give it a much broader perspective, a greater conceptual framework so that one will then look at poverty and the reduction and the solutions and the proposed anti-poverty programs, okay, along not just providing money or income, but to look at particular capabilities that an individual would need if the individual would then have the flexibility of obtaining a wider range of job opportunities later. This is the reason why more than just income, okay, a lot of studies on poverty and the like now focus on a wider range of other indicators that have to do with whether these capabilities are being satisfied. Okay. Here, for example, is the Gini index, which shows, as I showed to you last time, that there hasn't been much of a substantial change in the distribution of income from 1988 to 2015. That's the distribution of income. But here's the Human Development Index, which is a supplement, shall you say, to the other indicators in that the Human Development Index is discussed extensively in your textbook in the readings. Is an index that puts in together the GNI per capita, the literacy rate, and the infant mortality rate. Okay, so in addition to income per capita, it includes literacy rate as an indicator for the proportion of the population with education, and the infant mortality rate as a measure of the quality of healthcare in the country. Countries with very low infant mortality rates are countries that have a very efficient and effective healthcare system. Okay. Um, what this means is that a lot of children are attended to before they are 1 or 2 years old. A characteristic of developing countries and of countries in the past, including the developed countries when they were still developing, was a very high rate of infant mortality. But once the infant mortality rates fell, that is due to improvements in the healthcare system. So the Human Development Index has increased steadily for nearly all countries here in the ASEAN. Okay, although that of the Philippines is still not as high as with Singapore, Malaysia, and Thailand, but it has increased. Okay, and then there are data available on rates of stunting, underweight, wasting, and overweight per 100 children. Okay? And it shows an improvement in the nutritional status of children, even though maternal mortality rates are very sluggish, meaning to say the rate of mothers who pass away due to complications of childbirth. Okay, and the rate here is also quite high, again, reflecting the quality of the healthcare system in the country. Okay, so those are the data, an introduction to the data. Okay, and as I have discussed with a number of you who have consulted with me with regards to your research paper, that is what we shall be doing, especially in your research paper. And much later, when you write your papers for economic research, and even more so for those who will be writing your thesis, you'll have to be aware of the wide range of data that are available. I was trying to show to you a certain website, and I'll see if I can access it. Okay, just a minute. Here, Nation Master. This is one such website that you could find interesting because it tries to organize a lot of the data here. Okay. One of the things, though, that I noticed is that when they collected data in 1950 for GNI accounts, the Philippines was there, but so were Thailand and the others, which I found rather odd because I thought they started their GNP much later in the 1950s. But in any case, you could find this worthwhile source of data. Sample here, you can search for GNI per capita 1950. Then you have a wide range beer consumption per capita and the like. I suppose I should have placed here GNP per capita. Uh-huh. GNP per capita 1950. Greenhouse. Wala dito, but there. Okay, you have consumer goods nominal expenditure per capita, domestic private health expenditure per capita. Okay, so these really provide you with substantial data, 115 pages per, per country. I wonder if we're specified per country. Alcohol consumption pa rin. But anyway, you could find this worthwhile for your research purposes. Now, what will what we shall be doing now for the rest of the semester is to look at now theories. Okay, that is the main focus of the course, to look at the various theories of economic development. Okay, if I can just 2 minutes. Sorry. All right. Okay. So what I'll be discussing for the rest of the semester would be an introduction to the theories that explain the process of economic development. Okay. The first part, which is now the second part of our course, is to look at the theories that look at the entire process of economic development. They look at economic development in general. Okay. And there are very many approaches to the study of economic development in general. Okay. The textbook of De Genre and Sadode provides you with a chapter that details the history of economic development theories. It starts from the 1800s, but actually spends a lot more time in the post-World War II era to show how their emphasis reflected things that were happening in the global economy. Okay. For now, I'll be using the typology developed by Amartya Sen, which is in your readings, okay, where he says that there are very, very many theories and theoretical approaches to the issue of studying economic development, but just for purposes of simplification, okay, they can all be organized into 4 main groups, and they're organized based upon their assumption with regards to 2 important axiomatic points. For those of you who have already gone through your microeconomics, okay, Mascolel and the like, you know that when you're talking of theories, there are certain axioms, a starting point of a theory. An axiom is a statement that is accepted without proof. It's agreed upon that that is the case. Okay. So in microeconomics, okay, it's axiomatic that human beings behave rationally. And rationally means that they maximize something, their utility or their profit, okay, based upon a well-defined set of constraints. So that the rational behavior is behavior that is consistent with constrained maximization. Okay, so a consumer faced with the desire to maximize his or her utility, but constrained by the budget, which is a combination of the person's income and the prices of goods, will end up making decisions such as choice of goods to purchase, how much of each of those goods to purchase, and the level of savings he or she would like. So that is rational economic behavior. So it is axiomatic that human beings behave rationally. Okay, and then you have the axiom also in macroeconomics, where if you argue that supply creates its own demand, then you begin with what is called the monetarist or the neoclassical approach to macroeconomics. But if you argue that demand creates its own supply, that would be the Keynesian approach. Now, in economic development, according to Sen, you can classify theories based upon their attitude to two axioms. Okay, there's the monoeconomics argument, and there's the mutual benefits argument. The monoeconomics argument is the argument that um, that economic theory is applicable to any country at any point in its history. Okay? So you do have those that uh, accept the monoeconomics argument, and there are those who say otherwise. And in fact, they develop theories specific, in this instance, specific to developing countries. The other action is the mutual benefits argument. The mutual benefits argument being that um, the developed and developing countries benefit mutually from interacting. The interaction would involve trade, foreign direct investment, migration, and free movement of peoples by way of tourism and the like. There are those who assume and accept that developed and developing countries mutually benefit from interacting with each other. Then there are those who deny and argue that the, the international economic system makes it difficult for developing countries to benefit from it. So there are those that accept the mutual benefits, there are those who reject mutual benefits, there are those who accept monoeconomics, there are those who reject monoeconomics. Okay. Those that accept the monoeconomics argument and also accept the mutual benefits argument, okay, is classified as neoclassical economists. Okay. These neoclassical economists are the ones that you've encountered in your microeconomics and your macroeconomics. Those are the basic branches of neoclassical economic analysis, which is the mainstream or the dominant school of economic analysis. Okay? But there are those who accept the mutual benefits, but they reject the monoeconomics argument. And these were the original development economists who emerged in the 1950s, okay, where they argued that the neoclassical economic analysis, the theories actually have the structure of developed countries in mind, which is why one needed to develop theories specific to the situation of developing countries. Okay? You'd have here authors like William Arthur Lewis and uh, and Walt Husto and John Fay and Gustav Ranis, okay, uh, John Harris and Michael Todaro. Okay, they developed theories specific to the situation of developing countries. Okay, it's actually quite interesting that many of the theories that they developed have also ended up being applied to the situation in developed countries when one is analyzing the levels of poverty and instances of unemployment and underemployment in those countries. But we'll get to that later. Then you have theories that accept the monoeconomics argument, but they reject the mutual benefits argument. And you have here the Marxian theories of economic development. Then you have theories that reject the monoeconomics argument and also reject the mutual benefits argument. They're the neo-Marxian theories. Okay, so these typologies might be able to help in trying to order our study of theories of economic development, which is why what we'll be doing in the second part of the course is to look at theories that focus on the development process in general. And we will begin with the neoclassical theories. Then we will be looking at development theories. The most prominent would be the historical treatise, the theories, the stages of growth theories, and you have the structural theories, most prominently being the dualist theory. And then we look at Marxian and neo-Marxian theories, since the neo-Marxian especially developed from the Marxian approach. Okay. And in the last part of the course, we'll be looking at selected topics. Okay. Agriculture, migration and industrialization, uh, capital and finance in economic development, population and environment, international trade. Okay. In each of these topics, we will look at the data. Okay, what are the data specific to these particular topics? And then we will look at theories that explain each of these topics in reference to the process of economic development. We'll be looking at neoclassical theories, development theories, and Marxian and neo-Marxian theories. All of these just by way of course, an introduction to the subject matter of economic development. Okay. So if there are no questions as of the moment, I'll proceed and I'll be discussing with you now your neoclassical theories of economic development. Okay. When you talk about neoclassical approach to economic issues, okay, neoclassical approaches focus on a few factors or variables because there's great emphasis on the development of mathematical relationships among the variables. Okay. So that's the reason why you all had to take up your calculus and you had to endure through Mascolel in your microeconomics and your macroeconomics. The mathematization of economics uh, had its beginnings in 1890. There were already previous mathematical approaches. Okay, because if you look at the history of economics, the original authors like Adam Smith, um, Thomas Robert Malthus, David Ricardo, John Stuart Mill, all had a discursive approach. Discursive meaning to say a cuento, narrative, and the like. So if you look at their books, they're very thick books. They're all to use the words of an economist in reference to published works by sociologists and anthropologists. The original writings in economics were just words, just words. The first attempt at an abstract approach to economic analysis was done by David Ricardo. Okay. And the development of this abstract approach meant that uh, one would develop mathematical models and equations. So you had different authors like Cournot and uh, and Bentham and the like developing mathematics for some of them. It was Alfred Marshall who put them all together in his book, Principles of Economics, the first most widely used textbook that used the word economics. Before that, the subject matter was popularly known as political economy, which was a branch of political philosophy. But it was Alfred Marshall who first popularized the use of the word economics. Okay? And in his textbook, he presented the mathematical equations that explain and illustrate the theories that he presented. He presented them all in an appendix, but over time, it became the mainstream so that nowadays, textbooks in economics, especially classical, are just full of mathematical equations. Since mathematical models are developed in neoclassical economic analysis, a lot of those mathematical models can then be converted into statistical models. And that's why there's an emphasis in neoclassical theory on empirical verification through the use of statistical testing. Okay. And important in neoclassical analysis, insofar as these mathematical models are concerned, is the assumption of equilibrium. Alfred Marshall is a physicist. That's why he imported a lot of concepts from physics and incorporated them into developing the mathematical theories. Okay, and in physics, there is in physics the assumption here that if you can have different physical forces going in different directions, there's a tendency towards equilibrium and equality among the forces, which is what is present in a lot of the neoclassical models of the economy. The assumption that you have economic forces going in different directions, but they tend towards an equilibrium, like the equilibrium in the law of supply and demand, when supply and demand curves intersect in terms of aggregate supply and aggregate demand models. Okay, equilibrium occurs when at the point where aggregate supply and aggregate demand are equal. Aggregate demand and aggregate supply are always equal. That's an important difference between macroeconomics and microeconomics. Okay? So in microeconomics, it's possible for supply and demand for one good not to have an intersection. So it's a non-existent market. But the but in macroeconomics, aggregate demand and aggregate supply are always equal. Okay. The point at which aggregate demand and aggregate supply are equal is an equilibrium point if at that point, okay, there would be low inflation rate, low interest rate, and a stable exchange rate. Now, by the way, before I proceed, um, I'll also point out to you that this is the main aim of the course. It's for you to understand and develop an appreciation for these various theories, which is why for your examination, you have the review questions. All those questions there will involve your ability to discuss the different theories, present them in technical essays, where technical essays are like the papers that you have in your readings, where not only do you explain the theory and cite the authors of these theories, but you also present them with tables of data, graphs and charts and illustrations of data, and also the mathematical models. Okay. And for your research paper, The aim of the research paper is for you to show your ability to use a theory to analyze the data. Okay. In your research paper in chapter 2, that's a summary of the research that you've done, where you can organize them all in terms of policy issues, theoretical issues, methodological issues. Okay. For the policy issues, present tables of data to show that your topic is a current social and economic problem. Okay, so you show the data on the Philippines and other countries. Okay. So if your topic was poverty, then you show that poverty is a real problem in many countries, Philippines included, by looking at the data. Okay. And then you can just discuss the government proposed policies on dealing with poverty. Oh, by the way, before I forget, the spirit behind your conditional cash transfer program is to provide incentives to low-income families, okay, for to have their children regularly checked for nutrition, healthcare, and education. That's why the conditional cash transfer would always require children to have regular vaccinations and immunizations and regular checks and advice with regards to their nutrition, their food, especially for those being breastfed, and later that they also get regular cash allowance to ensure that their children would go to school regularly and complete an elementary education. Okay? So this is one of those policies on poverty the government. And then the theoretical issues would be a summary of the different theories on poverty, that's your topic. And then the methodological issues has a discussion of data and the various econometric models that were used to test and run. Okay. Your research question, therefore, is a conclusion of one of the theories, at most two. From the theories that you've had a look at, you would decide on focusing on these theories. Okay. And you will use the theory to analyze the data in this particular topic. And that will be what you'll be discussing in chapter 4. When you analyze your data, do not do any econometric modeling or any statistical testing. You do that in your economic research paper. What you do is to simply use the theory to analyze the data using basic statistical description. The purpose of the exercise is to see if you can use a theory in analyzing your data and to appreciate the uses and limitations of that particular data. This is the exercise that you would need in preparation for your completing your research paper in economic research. And for those of you who are going to write your thesis, this is how you do your thesis. It's a starting point. Okay, knowing how to focus your paper by having as your research question the conclusion or a conclusion of a theory, which you've chosen to be your theoretical frame. So now let's look at neoclassical theories of economic development. The original, the first theory that focused on the issue of long-term economic development was the Harrod-Domar growth model, which is actually an analysis of growth factors. Okay, it's named after Professors Roy Harrod and F.C. Domar. In the 1950s, they were professors in Harvard University and Massachusetts Institute of Technology. And this should give you an introduction to what a theory in economics is. A theory in economics always has author's name or names attached to it. That's why in your research, you cannot tell me that you're using human capital theory. I'll ask which author offers of a human capital theory, because there are many human capital theories. Okay. So here we have the Harrod-Domar growth model. The Harrod-Domar growth model starts off from macroeconomics by assuming first the usual. Okay. So on the demand side, total savings is a stable fraction of total income Y, where the fraction saved is small letter s, which represents your marginal propensity to save. On the supply side, you have the total capital stock of a country is equal to total output Y times K, which is the capital output ratio, the average number of units utilized in the production process in a country. So the higher the K, the more capital intensive the country's economy is. Therefore, it's also an indicator of a developed economy, the larger K is. Okay. Now, if we go back to my argument before that in macroeconomics, um, aggregate demand is always equal to aggregate supply. Okay. But macroeconomic equilibrium is guaranteed when, at that point, you have a low inflation rate, a low interest rate, and a stable exchange rate. Okay. Now, from your macroeconomics, you know that aggregate demand can be raised through combination of fiscal or monetary policies. Okay. Through change in the IS and LM curve and the like. So with the shift in the aggregate demand curve, you would end up with a higher GNP. But there's also an increase in price levels, which is why the Harrod-Domar growth model is trying to address the fact that in order for economic development to be attained, there's a necessary to maintain macroeconomic equilibrium, which means that as aggregate demand is increased, so should aggregate supply. So that when aggregate demand increases and aggregate supply also increases, they'll end up in a point at which aggregate supply equals aggregate demand, where the GNP level is higher, but the price levels do not increase too much. So effectively, a reliance on aggregate demand policies would have a long-term disequilibrium effect in terms of causing inflationary pressures. And you know that the inflation, interest rate, exchange rate are all related to each other. Okay, when there's the expectation of a higher inflation, say in the Philippines compared to the USA, there could be an expectation of uh, a peso devaluation. Okay, which means that there could be a demand for US dollars. Okay, people would place their assets in US dollars since they're expecting that with the inflation rate here higher than in the USA, the Philippine peso might end up being devalued. So there's a tendency towards greater devaluation. But if there's a higher inflation rate, it's also possible that this could trigger a higher interest rate. Okay, one of the means, as you know, to deal with inflationary expectations is to raise interest rate. But the thing about raising the interest rate is that this can then attract foreign funds into our assets. peso-denominated assets, okay? So what would happen is, by attracting foreign funds to shift to peso-denominated assets in order to take advantage of the higher interest rate, keep in mind that the interest rate is based upon the currency, not the location. That's why if you have a US dollar account here in the Philippines, the interest rate on that will not be affected. Okay. If those US dollars are converted to peso, then they can take advantage of the peso denominated interest rate. So with the increase in interest rate, it would mean greater pressure towards the appreciation of the peso. So what does this mean? Okay. You have higher inflationary expectations would mean expectations for a devaluation of the peso. But with higher interest rate expectations, their expectations of an appreciation of the peso. So what is the net effect? The net effect is an unstable exchange rate. Okay, you have the higher inflation rate and the higher interest rate having contrary effects on the exchange rate. Okay, and so what happens when you have macroeconomic disequilibrium? The argument of neoclassical analysis is that it will cause an economic slowdown because a lot of decisions by households and firms have to be postponed. Okay, households would not engage too much in consumption expenditure because of the higher prices, plus the fact that you do have uncertainty about the prices over imported goods, in the same way that investors would have a disincentive to invest. For those with substantial imported inputs, they cannot predict their future cost. For those with substantial export earnings, they also cannot predict what their future earnings shall be. Plus, they have to deal with the possibility of higher interest rate costs and the like. So it will cause a slowdown. Okay. That's why the Harrod-Domar growth model is trying to identify factors on the demand and the supply side so that one can use this as a tool to ensure that if we have an increase on the demand side through a combination of your fiscal and monetary policies by way of the ISLM, then there'd also be the identification of certain policies that will cause the aggregate supply curve to also shift to the right so that you can have a bigger increase in GNP with price levels not increasing too much and therefore maintaining macroeconomic equilibrium. So this is the demand side and this is the supply side. The equilibrium condition is the usual Say's law. Equilibrium, the total savings equal total investment. Okay, usually called in macroeconomics is the Say's law. Equilibrium named after the French economist Jean-Baptiste Say. Although, of course, authors have noted that there are actually 6 or 7 different Say's laws. But anyway, this is one. Say's law, equilibrium, total savings equal total investment. Now, assume that investment expenditure leads towards a change in the stock of capital, okay? K, capital K, is the capital stock, the total value of all machinery, equipment, buildings, land improvements in society, the total capital stock. Okay? And the aim of investment is to change the stock of capital, to add on to the machinery, equipment, buildings, land improvements in society. So therefore, the assumption that total investment results in a change in capital, if you combine the equations, you'll get that total savings S is equal to total income Y times the marginal propensity to save. Okay. Total investment is equal to the change in the stock of capital, which is equal to K, the capital output ratio, times the change in total output Y. Okay. So collecting the terms, we get delta Y over Y is equal to S over K. Delta Y over Y happens to be the growth rate. So the idea is that equilibrium between the demand and supply sides can be attained if the growth rate is targeted to be equal to the ratio of the savings rate to the capital output ratio. Okay. And this Harrod-Domar growth model has been utilized a lot in a lot of macroeconomic plans because this allows for targeted levels of revenues, foreign funds, and the like. So, for example, if, say, total savings in the Philippines is about 18%, capital output ratio is 3, then it would mean that the equilibrium growth rate is about 6%. For Philippine growth rate to be raised to 7% would require the savings rate to be raised from 18 to 21%. Okay. But you cannot cause savings to be increased in a year's time because the massive increase in savings would mean a reduction in consumption. And that's one of the things about societies. People do not want a radical alteration in their standard of living. And the standard of living is expressed in the total consumption expenditure of households. So you cannot force a sudden increase in savings because that would mean forcing people to reduce their standard of living. At the same time, uh, with an 18% savings rate to attain uh, the higher growth rate of 7%, you cannot reduce the capital output ratio. In fact, the direction of development is to raise the capital output ratio, which is why, therefore, in order to attain the 7% growth rate, the savings rate should be raised to 21%. But since you cannot obtain, it is 3% higher than, than the 18%. If domestic savings cannot provide for the 3% increase, it means it will allow one to calculate the targeted level of foreign funds that will be needed to attract uh, foreign investment, foreign aid, net exports, and the like, in order to raise the country's growth rate to 7%. So if the country has a 1 trillion peso GNP, okay, the 3% of 1 trillion pesos will become uh, 30 billion pesos. Okay, so 30 billion pesos becomes the targeted level of foreign investment, foreign aid, foreign debt, and net exports that should be needed in order for the economy to reach a higher growth rate. Okay. Now, the next theory here now focuses on how to understand the supply curve Y. The demand curve, this Y here on the demand side, is the focus of macroeconomics. We have here ISLM analysis that focuses on the factors that can raise aggregate demand, essentially the IS and the LM side. But then, how about the supply side? Okay. The solo growth model was the first attempt to model the supply side of an economy. Okay. It's named after Professor Robert Solow, then of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. The argument of the solo growth model is that the capital to labor ratio would determine the output per head. Okay. I'm sorry. So it begins with the production function, which comes from microeconomics. Okay, and he imagines Q will be the production function of the entire economy. from microeconomics, output Q is a function of labor and capital. Okay. And he multiplies it with A, which he calls the technology factor. Okay. And then Solo argues that the macroeconomic production function is constantly turns to scale. Okay. Or to use mathematical language, it's linearly homogeneous. What this means is that if, say, labor and capital are both raised or increased by a factor lambda, then output also increases by a factor lambda. So it's constant returns to scale. And it's argued that this is the type of a production function that's consistent with a competitive market economy. Because if lambda, um, when the increase in labor and capital by lambda results in output increasing by less than lambda, that would be called decreasing returns to scale, which suggests some technological backwardness. Okay. On the other hand, if the output increases by greater than lambda, that is increasing returns to scale, which is the nature of the production functions of monopolies, especially natural ones. Okay. So that's why constant returns to scale assumption is seen as the most reasonable one for the entire economy. In this case, then, if lambda were 1 over L, then one can then put forth the mathematical argument that Q over L is equal to A times a function of capital over the labor ratio. Q over L is output per laborer, okay, which is a proxy for GNP per capita. Okay. Keep in mind that GNP per capita is GNP over the entire population. Okay. But that population includes those who are not working, such as those who are young and those who are retired and those who are not in the labor force. Okay. So therefore, one other way of measuring the standard of living in the country is to obtain Q over the labor force. So Q over L is equal to A times the function of capital labor ratio. The result here is curious. Okay. Countries with higher GNP per capita would have higher Q over L. This suggests that they would have a higher capital over labor ratio. Okay. So one of the conclusions of the solo growth model is consistent with the Harrod-Domer growth model, which is that if you have foreign funds flowing from developed to developing countries, that could cause the capital levels in developing countries to increase. So you have a higher capital labor ratio, therefore allowing the developing countries to raise their output per head and their GNP per capita towards the levels of the developed countries. Okay. Sorry. Of course, it's argued that capital will flow to where it has a higher rate of return. And this conclusion of the solo growth model and the Harrod-Domer growth model is consistent with the microeconomic theory. Okay. The rate of return is usually higher when it is the scarce factor of production. Okay. And by this neoclassical analysis, capital would have a higher rate of return in developing countries because it is the scarce factor of production compared to labor. So it therefore could attract more capital from developed to developing countries. So this conclusion of the Haradomar and the solo growth models are consistent with microeconomic theory. By the way, when formulating your research question, please keep in mind that macroeconomic variables increase or decrease macroeconomic variables. Okay? But microeconomic variables never ever increase or decrease macroeconomic variables. Okay? It is simply illogical. For example, if you say that agricultural investment increases the GNP, that is not very logical because you know that agriculture is just a sector in the economy. What if you have an increase in agriculture, but a substantial decline in manufacturing and services? Okay, so agricultural investment could increase agricultural productivity. That is correct. It's both on the micro level. Okay, so microeconomics can never increase or decrease something that is macroeconomic. However, something macroeconomic can increase or decrease something microeconomic, okay? Such as inflation decreases agricultural sector employment, or inflation decreases agricultural sector income. That is logical. Okay? So keep that in mind when you formulate your research questions. Okay, macro can increase or decrease macro. Micro can increase or decrease. Macro can increase or decrease micro, but micro can never increase or decrease macro. Micro increases or decreases something micro as well. Okay? So anyway, here's that conclusion, that the higher capital labor ratio increases GNP per capita. But actually, there's another factor here involved. This is technology, which Professor Solo simply said, any factor other than capital or labor. He used capital and labor because those were the factors of production for microeconomic production functions. So he just generalized it for the entire economy. Okay. So what does one do when one has a theory like this? The main argument of this theory is that capital over the labor ratio can increase output per head, Q over L. But the equation also points out that there's another factor, which is technology. Okay. When there's a change in technology, even when capital labor ratio does not change, it can cause output per labor to go up. So the traditional method in neoclassical analysis then is to collect data and verify it empirically. And this is done by Simon Kuznets. Simon Kuznets is a very important figure in quantitative economics because he did a lot of the initial research involving the collection of data, the processing of data, and the like. And this was done in the 1950s and 60s when you still did not have a very strong computing power. Okay. Apropos the students here who are taking economic research and who will be taking it later and writing a thesis or the like, keep in mind that one of the characteristics that separate econometric papers before 2005 and after was the exponential increase in computing capacity since 2005, which is why you can now have econometric models with several variables and with thousands of data observations. Whereas before, because of limited computing capacity, most econometric models can only handle very few regressors. So in the case of Simon Kuznets, he was part of the team in the United States of America that first developed the GNP data for the USA. in the 1930s. He's the one responsible for the analysis of the consumption function, from which you obtain the result that the long-term consumption function is a stable function of national income. He analyzed data from 1867 to 1945, but the short-term consumption study will show that consumption was an increasing function of income, in that in the short run, consumption increases with the change in the marginal propensity to save. That's why in macroeconomics of the development of the consumption theories, like your life cycle hypothesis of consumption, the permanent income hypothesis, which are attempts to explain the difference between short-term consumption functions and the long-term consumption function. Another valuable empirical work of Simon Kuznets had to do with this verification of the the argument put forth by Robert Solow. Okay, so okay, again, my apologies. I have to be back in about a minute. All right. Okay, we're back. As some of you might know, the indefatigable Mahalaya Ravago, and she once gave us a report, her initial findings when she decided to poll graduate students. I don't know if some of you participated in that, but it mentioned here that graduate students were requesting that there be a regular break during our online classes. So in my case, I can't help it, but I need to have a regular break. My bladder breaks and the like, so you'll automatically get those breaks, but it cannot be as long as 10 minutes though, because I did so often anyway. So you could be getting more breaks than the regular 10-minute break. So anyway, let's proceed. So now, what Simon Kuznets did is to therefore try and test the solo growth model. Okay. By the early 1960s, there was already substantial data from several countries, those that had GNP data, the Philippines being among them. And these countries, they made estimates on the value of capital stock, which, by the way, is not um, available every year. Okay, there are very, very many methods of measuring capital stock. So some countries have that data, others it's not done. So you have to do the estimation yourself. Okay, capital stock data is not as easily measured and the like. Part of the issue being theoretical, which is that capital stock, when measured, I'm sorry, in theory, capital stock should include the country's stock of human capital, and that is what's notoriously difficult to measure. How do you estimate the value of the human capital in a country. Okay. There are estimates available for the total value of land, total value of machinery, equipment, buildings, and land improvements and the like. So put these together, that is a measure of physical capital stock. Okay. Right. So Kuznets then had all that data available. He also used as a data for labor the size of the labor force in the country. Okay. So he used what is called the Cobb-Douglas production function, named after the mathematicians Professors Cobb and Douglas. And a linearly homogeneous function would be Q equals A times K alpha L vita, where alpha plus vita equals 1. And of course, to do a statistical test, the equation that one will be regressing has to be converted into an additive function. So the additive equation that is consistent with this Cobb-Douglas production function is the logarithmic transformation, which is ln of q equals ln of a plus alpha ln of k plus vita ln of l. Again, notice there are only two regressors. Okay, again, it's a historical curiosity. Nowadays, you can have up to 28 regressors, but back in the 1960s, 1950s, the computing capacity was extremely limited. Okay, if you'd like to watch a very entertaining and yet very educative film, I suggest you, in your free time, try to watch this film, Hidden Figures. Okay. It shows to you how NASA computed and did the computation for things like the trajectories of the entry, exit and entry of their spacecraft in the 1960s and the like. And it shows to you that a lot of the computations in the 1960s were being done using manual calculation. Okay, the lead uh, the lead character, that of Dorothy Johnson, played by Tara J. Henson, did her computations all by hand. Okay, although some would say that at that time the more usual one in doing the complicated measurements were done by what is called a slide rule, which I suppose is already a museum artifact for all of you. Okay, in the film Apollo 13, when the spacecraft was already about to enter the the Earth atmosphere, and they wanted a calculation of the trajectory so that they would know where to enter. The computation, if you know, was used using what is called a slide rule. A slide rule, the one that was shown in the film, was the ruler type, because there's slide rules which are circular. The one that was shown in the film, which showed their computation, was the ruler type. That's a slide rule. So that would explain to you the difference between econometrics before and econometrics after. Okay. When I was a graduate student in the 1980s, when one takes econometrics, okay, one spends a lot of time. For example, when you already have, say, your structural model, your structural model here is Q equals A, K alpha, LV. Okay. And if your structural model actually has several variables, okay, and you convert it into an additive equation, but your equation has, say, 8 variables, it's reduced form. Okay. Much of econometrics is to try and show what the reduced form with 3 regressors would be equivalent to the reduced form with 8 regressors. That's how you get into things like 3-stage least squares, 2-stage least squares, and all that sort of thing. So most of the econometric work involve proving that uh, econometric equation with 3 regressors is the equivalent of the original reduced form that has 8 to 10 regressors, because computers could not handle a lot of regressors. So this particular 3 regressor equation, you'd have to prove that it's consistent with the larger one so that you can run it. Okay, and not only was computing capacity limited at the time, it was also not free. Okay, kaya noon, whenever we had to do our computation, the university would connect to the what is called the mainframe, the large computer. You can see it in Hidden Figures, an example of a large computer at the time. A computer being the size bigger than the conference room of the economics department, for those of you who remember it. Okay, and usually in the universities and the research institutes, we connect to the what is called the mainframe of the US Department of Defense. And we're allotted certain free time periods to do research and the like. But we were warned not to have too many regressors because, we might end up using up uh, the free computer time allotted to research institutes. Okay, and that's why one of the issues then of econometrics is to ensure what's called efficiency, making sure that your 3 regressor econometric model is the equivalent of the 8 and makes it efficient, meaning to say it's able to measure it accurately at minimum computing time. And the computing time was computing time, like when we would estimate when we do our um, computing, I mean, when we finally get the particular regression equation, and once you press the enter button, then we would usually, okay, let's go out for lunch. Okay, then we'll be back after 3 to 4 hours and the like, and see what the results were, and that would be fast. And as usual, if it returns, then they'll say error, and then you have to figure out on your own what the error was. But ever since 2005, actually it began to speed up in the late 1990s, but even more so in 2005, with a huge increase in computing capacity because of the changes in laptop technology and the like. Okay, you can have as many as 28 regressors already, and that's why there's a huge difference between learning your econometrics then as opposed to learning your econometrics now. Okay. My colleague Dr. Lansona keeps on saying that I don't know anything about econometrics, which to a degree is true. Because once I completed my PhD, much of my work, I did not like to do much econometric work anymore. So I'm no longer familiar with those data. Like, if I need to do some econometrics, you should just ask, can you all do this? Because I'm really more focused on looking at the uh, quantitative and non-quantitative, meaning to say I don't think I need to know the nitty-gritty of how to make an econometric run. What matters is the analysis using the theory, and but that's a very long story. But anyway, so now this is just a guide for you when you read papers in economics. You'll notice a lot of the papers from the classic papers, 1950s, 60s, and the like, they did not have very complicated econometric models. Okay, they would emerge much later, which is why for your research, when you're doing economic research later, okay, keep that in mind, that you should focus on looking at econometric models developed since 2005, since computing capacity can now handle that and can handle large masses of data. Okay, so now let's look at this here. If you look at the logarithmic transformation, you have ln of q equals ln of a plus alpha ln of k plus beta ln of l. Now, according to the original theory, which is this, okay, the main factors explaining your dependent variable, which is q, would be labor and capital. So it's labor and capital, which are the main factors. And therefore, you're trying to focus on estimating the coefficients alpha and beta, which if you look at this equation, if you obtain the first derivative, alpha and beta represent the elasticity of capital and labor, respectively, with respect to output Q. I mean, the elasticity of output Q with respect to capital and labor. Okay. Now, according to the theory, A is technology. Technology was all factors other than capital and labor, which meant that by theory, they were residual. That's why in your statistical testing, your ln of A would be referred to as the residual factors, or the other way is yung error term. Okay? So, ang tawag sa kanya ay residual factors, meaning to say they're not the important factors according to your original theory. Once Simon Kuznets ran the regression, he found out that the bulk of the variation in ln of Q was actually due more to A rather than capital or labor. So in other words, A, your original residual factor, turned out to be a bigger, major explanatory factor for ln of Q, which is why in neoclassical papers since then, they've been trying to explain what ln of A would be, what the residual factors are, which is why you will encounter the use of the term the residual factors of economic development. So when they say the residual factors of economic development, they do not mean the unimportant factors. On the contrary, they're looking for the important ones. Okay, and that's the history behind the terminology that you'll be encountering. Okay, so there have been very many neoclassical theories that attempted to explain what ln of A happens to be, what the residual factors are. Okay? And these are the most widely used theories and explanations in the neoclassical literature. Okay, you have human capital, then research and development, the economies of scale argument, and the argument of labor movement from low to high productivity jobs. Okay. Now, first is human capital. Theories of human capital are very old. Very old. They date back to the 1800s and the like. Okay, and originally, human capital referred to the education and skills of the labor force. The difference between human capital and labor L is that labor L is simply the size of the labor force, the number of human beings working there. Human capital refers to the education and skills training that they have. Okay? So the idea is that even if you have the same labor force, one labor force in another country that has on average higher levels of education and skills training would attain a higher output compared to the same size of a labor force from another country with lower levels of education and skills training. Okay? So this was the idea behind human capital. So many of the neoclassical authors argued that that was the main reason for the difference, the disparity in output per head between the developed and developing countries. That developed countries had higher levels of human capital, but human capital at the time was focused on education and skills training. And this was the motivation behind the support given by the United Nations and many developed country governments to support the establishment of universities and technical institutes in developing countries, and also for the establishment of university and technical institutes in developed countries. Okay? Before the 1950s, it was possible for a person to even rise to becoming president of the USA or heads of government in Europe without a college degree. Okay, that's the case with President Harry Truman of the United States, for example, president from 1945 to 1944 to 1952. But since then, because of the importance attached to human capital, eh, completing a college degree is now been seen as mandatory, okay, in most societies. That's why they often would note that, say, if a person like Joseph Estrada became president of the Philippines, but he hardly had any college degree, that attract attention. Okay. So this is the case, the justification for promoting university education and technical institutes in all countries throughout the world, especially in developing countries. Okay. But by the 1970s, okay, it was noted that although more universities and technical institutes have been established in developing countries, still you had that wide gap between the developed and the developing countries. Okay. So again, like what they would do among neoclassicists, they entered into research, collected data, and the like. Diyan yung mayaman ng mga economists when they're able to propose a research and get funding, okay, and then justify why this research is going there. Diyan yung mayaman ng mga economists. Kaya kung may economist na mayaman, which is not usual, he or she spends a lot of time doing research. Hindi masyado sa pagtuturo. Okay? Now, so so when research was done, among the things they found out among developing countries is that the ones who are able to finish university education tend to come from the small portion in the country's population that already had high incomes. Okay? They already come from the middle to the higher income classes. The majority of the population from the lower income classes are not able to complete a university education. And further study noted something that among developing countries, the low income segment of the population, okay, always had problems when it came to childhood nutrition, healthcare, and education, which I discussed with you in terms of social exclusion. Okay. Among developed countries, okay, childhood nutrition, access to health care, and elementary education were not problems. Okay. That's why it was possible for very many to enter universities and complete a college degree. But among developing countries, large numbers, okay, were deprived of proper nutrition in childhood or health care and were not able to complete even elementary education. That's why it is said that for developing countries, when you're now talking therefore of human capital investment, one has to go beyond expenditure on schools and university education and technical institutes, but also to focus on expenditures on childhood nutrition, access to healthcare, and basic education, to see that there will be an increase in what is called the cohort survival rate. Okay, so this was one of the motivations behind the extension and the mandatory implementation of the K to 12 educational program. So with the CCT, plus this, it would therefore increase the chances of more and more being able to reach tertiary level education, okay, and realize the benefits, the theoretical benefits that come with higher human capital investment. Okay. So that was one. Another theory that was developed in the neoclassical tradition is the idea of research and development, R&D. Okay, R&D involves the expenditure on the development of new products and new processes. Okay, because if you look at microeconomic theory, the theory of the firm, okay, the firms there are assumed to engage in the production of standardized commodities, commodities whose technology is well known, well established, and they just uh, are able to maximize their profits by the sheer efficiency of their production operations and the like. R&D is a different form of investment expenditure because it involves the investment in developing new products and new processes. And expenditure on developing new products and new processes is huge. It requires substantial expenditure. Okay. When I used to teach statistics, I looked at the data that Microsoft spends on research and development. And from 2001 to 2005 or 2006, every year they spend at least 5 billion US dollars on research and development, okay, in upgrading existing software and developing new software. Huge expenditures, therefore, on researching into new products and new processes are very risky because they involve huge expenditure. And a huge expenditure would mean a much longer payback period, which therefore raises the risk of developing products and processes that do not become marketable, so that you have this substantial market risk and risk of loss. Okay, data are not available, but it's estimated that for every one successful new product or new process, there are at least 10 failures. Okay. If you recall, I don't know, some of you might remember back in the 1980s, you had, when it comes to videotapes, you first had Betamax, which was followed by the VHS, then by the DVD. But now, what do we have? It's all software, Blu-ray, and what have you. I'm not familiar with that. But here's the idea. So you have a new product that might be successful for a while, like Betamax and the like, but then it could be replaced. And that's why research and development expenditure is very expensive and very, very risky. Okay. There is, in fact, a collection at the Historisch Germanisch Museum in Munich, in Germany. It's a very fascinating one because it shows there on exhibit all the products and processes that did not find the market, that failed. There are lots of them there, like those electric toothbrushes and a lot of the cars that were manufactured, designed and manufactured by the Soviet Union and the other former East Bloc countries and the like. It's just fascinating. Now, having said that, if you have a successful new product or new process, the idea here is that it has both microeconomic and macroeconomic ramifications. Okay. On the microeconomic level, it would mean substantial profits for the firm that developed it. And substantial profits would mean higher incomes as well for all those employed in developing this new product and in its manufacture. So on the demand side, you have an increase in profits and incomes. Okay? But on the supply side, on the macro level, the interesting thing is this: it has a social impact. In general, from sociology, it is argued that a new product or a new process becomes successful because it reduces the time spent on so many necessary activities. And by reducing the time spent on them, it increases productivity directly, or it would increase productivity in other sectors of the economy. So it is said that with the development in human history of gas cooking and electrical cooking, then there was no longer this need to rely on firewood. So it substantially reduced on the space requirement in kitchens and also minimized the possibility of fires. Firewood is a fire hazard. So you need wide open space far away from a flammable house and the like. But then with gas cooking and electrical cooking, it's now possible for the kitchen to be right there in the house. Okay. And it substantially reduces the time spent doing the cooking, which meant that there could be more time to do other things for, for the individuals. Okay. So with the development of personal computers, it would allow for more research to be actually produced and undertaken, unlike before. So therefore, you do have substantial increases in productivity whenever you have a very successful product. It substantially increases in productivity throughout the entire economy. So you might have the same labor force and the same value of the stock of capital, but with the entry of a new product, new process that substantially raises productivity, then it increases total out far more than what the capital and labor resources suggest. Okay. Now, it is said, though, that for developing countries, the more cost-effective approach is not so much to develop new products and new processes, but to adapt um, existing technology. Okay, adaptation by itself is very expensive. First, there is the search cost. You'd have to spend so much and searching all the available technologies in different parts of the world, which is what we did insofar as this COVID vaccine is concerned. And then there is now the choice of the technology and its adaptation, okay, which is an additional cost. But it's said that put together the search cost and the adaptation cost, it's more cost effective than actually developing new products and processes. And for example, if you're adopting manufacturing technology, um, a lot of manufactured goods, for example, might need to be adapted because their metals might melt in the humidity, the heat and humidity here. So you need the the adaptation of the metals there so that the metals can be able to handle heat and humidity here. And it is also said that when it comes to technology, it is agricultural technology that requires substantial investment in adaptation. So if we're going to adapt, say, a technology that raises the productivity of cocoa plants to produce cocoa for the production of chocolate or rice, for example, or even wheat, the idea is that such a technology would need to be adapted to the soil conditions, the climate patterns, precipitation, and the like. And they vary. You know that for those of you who are from Mindanao, Mindanao on average gets more rainfall than Central, Southern, and Western Luzon in general. Okay, which is why perhaps many parts of Mindanao might not need irrigation the way that parts of Luzon would, especially since in parts of Mindanao, like I'm familiar in Davao, Cagayan de Oro, it rains nearly every day. Okay, so these are considerations when we're talking here about technological adaptation. Why technological adaptation might be more crucial, especially in agricultural technology. Okay. Next is economies of scale. Economies of scale refer to large scale production. You get to see that from microeconomics, where when the scale of operations increases, per unit costs decrease. Okay. You have two types of economies of scale. There's internal and external economies of scale. Okay. Internal economies of scale happens when one firm increases the scale of operations. So with that, you'd have a reduction in the per unit costs of production. So therefore, with greater production, there'll be greater revenue. But with lower per unit cost of production, you have less cost, so therefore greater revenue, and lower costs would mean greater profits and therefore more funds for further investment. Okay, on the demand side. And on the supply side, you have greater output. So it is said that with more and more of the large firms, okay, an economy can experience an increase in total output with the same capital stock and labor force. Okay. There's the other form of economies of scale, which is external economies of scale. This happens when firms in a certain industry locate close to each other in a cluster. Okay. So what will happen is that the individual firms may remain small and medium scale, but the entire industry increases its output. More firms come in, and the entire industry realizes a higher level of output because the firms in that industry clustered close together. Okay. The most widely used example of this would be the fashion industry in New York and in London and Paris, where in these cities one can actually identify a particular district where the industries related to fashion have located close to each other. Okay, there are three main explanations, it is said, for why um, these external economies of scale are realized. Okay. When the firms in an industry have located close to each other, or another example here in the Philippines, by the way, was the university belt. All universities located close to each other in the Manila area. Okay. So, and also banks locate close to each other with their headquarters in Makati, okay, in BGC. So the idea is they're able to attain economies of scale as an entire industry because number one, you have what's known as labor market pooling. All those would like to work in these industries and have the skills for these industries know where to go to in search of jobs. So with this labor pool, the industry can now have access to the labor skills it is looking for in large quantity, and therefore they can they don't need to bid up the salaries or the wages. Okay. So it works well. You have laborers looking for the jobs that they're looking for, can find it, and the firms looking for the laborers that they need can actually find them. Okay. Next is the fact that, um, well, the other thing about labor market pooling is that information about job opportunities can spread much more easily, much more quickly when laborers working in the same industry happen to be seeing each other very closely in the district. So they can more easily get information on job opportunities and the like. Okay. Second is that they would have access to specialized inputs. Okay. So in the fashion industry that's located close to each other, okay, many of the manufacturers of buttons, zippers, fabrics, and the like, they also located there closely because that's their main market, which is why it is possible for them to easily get to sell their products, and at the same time for the users can easily get in touch with these suppliers of inputs to find out if they can provide at short notice large quantities of certain type of buttons, design of a certain type of buttons, zippers, or fabrics, and the like. So they're able to get access to their necessary inputs, and therefore it would substantially reduce all their costs. And finally, executives in the same industry can would usually be meeting regularly, especially when they are located close to each other. And you have what is known as information overspill. That information spillover, they can easily trade information that they can find worthwhile. Okay. Many firms in the industry are not direct competitors, they're often imperfect substitutes. So that in this type of competition, it involves a good deal of cooperation. They could encounter some information that they themselves might not find directly useful, but they know somebody in their industry who would benefit from such an information. For example, one whose main line of business is the production of athletic footwear could encounter information on leather footwear that he or she might not find worthwhile, but can pass on to a colleague whose firm focuses on leather footwear. And they're able to do that since their businesses are located close to each other. They're bound to meet each other regularly. So, given these three factors, it's said that the industry can grow in size even when individual firms remain small or medium scale. And the firms in the industry can realize economies of scale, meaning to say lower costs of production. Now, it is said that for developed countries, economies of scale can be realized quite easily because they already have the necessary infrastructure put in place. For developing countries to realize economies of scale, whether internal or external, they would need to invest in infrastructure. Okay. Finally, you have the labor movement from low to high productivity jobs, which in many ways summarize human capital issues and economies of scale issues. Okay. When the same labor force is able to move from low to high productivity jobs, it means the same labor force can now produce more output and earn more incomes. Okay. An indicator of a high productivity job is a high level of income. Okay. So on the supply side, you have greater output, and on the demand side, you have greater incomes. Although it is argued that a high income might not be a valid indicator for high productivity, especially if access to the high income jobs is a function of privileged access to education, to jobs, and to information. Okay. And privileged access, it is said, bedevils developing countries more than developed countries, in that a lot of the higher paying jobs in developing countries are said to be due more to the fact that people can have access to them by coming from the same school, by being part of the same social class, and therefore they're able to obtain privileged information on the availability of these jobs and the like. Okay. So, to a degree, it can explain the higher GNP in developed countries, but one has to check on the degree by which a lot of the higher income jobs are made available largely due to privileged access to education, to jobs, and to information. Okay, so these are your neoclassical theories of economic development. The next theory I'll be discussing with you is one of the original development theories, which is a theory of history. And this is the stages of growth theories. Okay. The original one being developed by Professor Walt Whitman Rostow, again, a professor. Not sure if he's in Harvard University or Princeton or Massachusetts, but one of those top Ivy League universities in the USA. And this particular theory bases itself on the historical experience of the developed countries, which in the 1950s were the Western European and the North American countries. So he developed a typology to identify factors that caused the developed countries to become developed countries, and to see what those factors are, and to see what particular factors can be replicated in developing countries so that they could also attain higher levels of material standard of living. Okay. The work by Rostow is called The Takeoff into Self-Sustaining Growth. Okay. And this was published in 1956. Okay. Now, as you know, the word takeoff, we associate it with uh, aircraft. And Professor Rostow, when he used the word takeoff, okay, was using the latest buzzword. Ganyan sa economics, he used the latest buzzword. Nowadays, I think the latest buzzwords are terms that have to do with the cyber world, information and the like. When you use terms like to boot, to input, and the like, avatar, those terms. The word takeoff, um, uh, commercial jet travel began only in the 1950s, mid 50s, and the like. And at that time, only the really, really high income could afford commercial jet travel. Either the really, really high income or those who were under government contract. Okay. So they're the ones who are able to hear the word take off. Okay. That's why Professor Rostow used that just to show he's cool. He knows the latest development in technology, which is commercial jet aircraft, I thought so. The takeoff into self-sustaining. Okay, so that is the theory of economic development. We'll discuss this next week. Okay, that's our second set of theory, and it's one of the original theories in development economics. Okay, so any questions or comments?
Sir, question on the
Yes, I'm ready.
discussion that you
Yes,
posted, sir. I think that's
yes.
one of the homeworks, right? So, can I clarify lang, sir, if that's free format and if the deadline is strictly on Friday and if we can upload via any format like Excel or does it have to be in PDF? So, what's the
It's really
right?
up to you. Kasi I did those discussion boards for the undergraduates. The purpose being that by writing essays and posting them, Um, I'm able to read, check, and make comments in preparation for their examination. So I can tell them whether the essay presented is a good technical paper or how it can be improved or why it's not very technical and the like. And it's not really graded. So I just posted it there for your own use, for your own
For own
benefit.
practice.
Yeah,
Okay.
it's just mainly for practice. And if you notice, those discussion boards are only up to population and environment because in the undergraduate, the coverage is only up to there. We were told that when it comes to online teaching, you cannot have an entire semester, just a quarter. So you have to reduce, prune, and then just focus on the most essentials. Okay.
All right.
So it's really up to you. In
All
fact,
right.
what I do, it's a good thing you mentioned that to me. I'm going to change the deadline so that you can actually put in your essays even much later.
All right. Thank you, sir. Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay. Any more questions and comments? As always, I'm going to be posting the recording of this at Canvas. And again, I will have to recommend that you download it soon as possible because Zoom tends to delete those files. They say 30 days, but I notice sometimes after 2 weeks, files are also deleted by Zoom. So, okay. Any more questions or comments? All right. So if there are none, I will then see you next week. And thank you very much for your patience. Okay. Next week, I'll be discussing now the stages of growth theories. The first theory in development economics that we will be encountering, one of the earliest theories in modern day development economics. Okay, so good night.
Thank you, sir. Have a good
Very
night.
well. My
Thank
Thank
you,
you,
pleasure.
sir.
sir.
Bye.
Good night
Thank you,
po.
sir.
I'll see you next week. Bye bye.